We carry years, decades of junk, old emotions into every day, and then wonder why we're not feeling happy, alive, present, playful. Viktor Frankl's work, Man's Search for Meaning, he found that if you're passionate about a purpose, you have the best chance to survive. I was swimming 10 to 12 miles a day, which is about 3 to 5 marathons in swimming. Get up, get moving, get outside, find your way of connecting with nature.
Therapist, personal coach, 2 times world record swimmer, cancer survivor, and the author of the amazing book, The Wild Cure. Our guest today on the Settle or Be Better podcast is Mr. Dean Hall, who's going to be talking to us about fighting cancer, the wild cure, and a lot more. So, welcome, Mr. Dean, and over to you. Why don't you begin by telling us a little bit about your personal health story?
Okay, I don't know exactly where. I guess I should start at the very beginning. I don't know exactly where you want me to start. I was born here in Portland, Oregon, the northwest corner of the United States. It's a very mountainous region. I was born only 4 blocks from Oregon's longest river, the Willamette, the one I ended up actually swimming. It's 187 miles long. It's the most important river to our home state because it starts up in the mountains and it comes down through both of our college towns, Eugene and Corvallis. Then it winds through farmland, comes through our state capital, Salem, and then moves into the Willamette Valley and is what made this area so fertile for farmers and now wine growers, vineyards. We have world-class vineyards in the Willamette Valley. And then it comes down through Oregon's largest city, Portland, where I was born and raised. And then it dumps into the Columbia, one of the world's longest, biggest, most powerful rivers. And it's always been a hub of activity, both for indigenous peoples, and then it was really what encouraged the white settlers to come and stay here. And so it's a very important river, and it's nestled in between two mountain ranges, the Cascade Range to the east, and then the coastal range to the west that's right before it drops into the ocean. And so I grew up in a very beautiful region where it was only an hour to the beach or 45 minutes into the mountains, only 30 minutes from 20 different rivers or lakes. And so it was an adventurer's playground. And I was fortunate enough, both of my parents were mountain climbers. And even my mom, back in the 60s, women weren't supposed to be doing things like that. They were just supposed to stay home and cook, but not my mother. She was out there climbing with the men and enjoying that. And the other thing that was very unique about my parents is that they were the only parents I knew in the 60s and 70s that had two things. One was they really loved each other. They were just crazy about each other. And most parents were just kind of blasé. They kind of had a relationship, but that was about it. They didn't have a real romantic love life like I saw my parents enjoy. The other thing was they were very athletic. They worked out. We had a home gym in our basement, which I'm the only kid I know whose parents both lifted weights. Back in the 1960s, that just didn't happen. And so I feel like I was extremely fortunate, like I won the lottery where parents were concerned. Spent most of my childhood out climbing with them in the wildest part of the mountains in the Cascades. There were times where we didn't see other people for days on end. And it was just for an adventurous child like I was, it was idyllic. And so that's kind of where my story starts.
That's amazing. That's a lovely story. And it's lovely seeing you share these things on your Instagram as well. And it's such a great new perspective on how you've grown up and how we can do things differently right now. So it's really amazing to know this little part of your life. And, coming to your cancer story and how
Mhm.
was it when you were diagnosed with it? How did that happen? When did that happen? And what was your first reaction to it?
Okay. Yeah. My first reaction, as is the case of most, is I was shocked because I had always stayed very healthy. I'd never taken drugs. I'd never smoked a cigarette in my life. Um, and I'd done a lot of triathlons. I'd always stayed in shape. It was very important to me to eat as healthy as I possibly at the time knew how. Uh, but the one thing that I think really led to my cancer diagnosis is I've always had a lot of energy. And so it wasn't unusual for me to only sleep 3 or 4 hours a night. I felt like I was kind of superhuman. Big mistake there. And I was always very interested in being very ambitious and getting ahead financially. And so from the time I was 15 to the time I was 42, I worked two jobs, sometimes three, just round the clock, basically, to make more money to provide wealth for my family. And we Americans are taught that you work really insanely hard. You buy a big house, you buy nice cars, you put a mountain of money in the bank so that someday when you're old, you can just stop everything and have fun. It makes no sense to me now, but I bought into that. And so I was just constantly putting money in a retirement account. And so when my doctor came and told me, I was surprised, but not too surprised. I'd been very tired, but I'd been working round the clock, and I thought that's the reason I was tired. The only way we found out is I had played college soccer and
Mm.
gotten my knee injured terribly, and I was going in for a total knee replacement. I was 47 years old at the time. It was 2007 was my first diagnosis, and we were taking the pre-surgical blood test. I had been a
Right.
teacher in this little town, a kind of a funny story. I'd been a teacher in this tiny little town for 20 years. I taught 11, 12, and 13-year olds, and now most of them had grown up and they were working in jobs throughout this little town that I was living in. And many of them worked as lab technicians. And so the nurse called me up and she said, Dean, your blood test came back bad. You need to come back in and take it again. Well, I'd been so healthy all my life. When she said my blood test had come back bad, I didn't think that there was anything wrong with me. I thought one of these old students had somehow fouled the test. And I said, "Oh, well, don't worry about it. Don't get anybody in trouble." And she said, "What?" And I said, it's okay if somebody made a mistake. I'll come back in. And she said, "Huh? I don't understand what you're talking about." And I said, "Oh, don't worry about it. I just don't want anybody to lose their job over this." And she said, "Well, nobody's going to lose their job. Would you please just come back in?" I went back in and took the test again. It still didn't occur to me that something was wrong with me until my doctor came in and said, we've taken two tests. And the reason he took the second test is because I had features of both acute leukemia and chronic leukemia. They'd never seen anyone with features of both. And my numbers were escalating so quickly. At first, they said if things hadn't changed, I only had about 6 weeks to live. So it was terrifying.
Wow. I mean,
Yeah.
right. And how did you sort of go ahead with it? Like, did you first begin with the usual treatment that your doctors would suggest, or did you immediately have a very completely different plan for yourself?
Well, my daughter was 14 at the time, and I don't know if you've been around 14-year-old girls much, but I believe they need their dads. And so I was just desperate to stay alive for her. And I went immediately to the oncologist, and he was a really wonderful. I was very fortunate. My first oncologist was from Uganda, and he was just this big, just wonderful man who had a very caring heart. And he explained the process to me. I'd had so many clients do chemo and radiation, and even after they'd gone into remission, were still suffering, not from the cancer, but from the treatment. And so I told him, you know, if I can do this without chemo and radiation, I'm going to. And he said, "What? No, we have to do this." And I said, "Well, by this time it had slid thankfully over into chronic leukemia, which bought me some time. Acute is more aggressive, as I'm sure you know." And I said, "Well, I've got chronic. Is it absolutely life threatening right now?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Okay, give me some time. I'm going to look into it." And he just shook his head and he said, "Okay, Dean, I'll help you however I can, but you have to take the treatments I suggest if you want to get better." And I said, "Well, thank you very much, doctor, but I believe I'm the boss of my body, not you. You're my hired hand or my consultant." And he kind of looked at me, but he laughed. He said, "Okay, I'll be your consultant." And which was very nice because once I moved back to Portland, I had to fire two oncologists because to try to understand them and to try to get to know if they would work with me, I would tell them that I'd say, "Hey, no disrespect, but I consider myself the leader here. You are my hired consultant. You're my expert. I'm not going to do what you tell me. I'm going to take it into consideration and then make the best decision for my body." First one was furious and just walked out. I thought he was going to slam the door. He says, "That's not how I work. I'm the boss." And I said, "Well, if I die, it doesn't affect you. It affects me." And he said, "I don't care. I'm not going to work with you." I said, "Okay, please refer me." The next one was much more gentle, but he said, "That's not how I work." So I said, "Okay, refer me again." And finally, I got a very caring doctor like the first one, and he was willing to work with me. So I think it's really important right off the bat, even though it's so terrifying, that you take ownership and you become your own best expert and advocate and the leader of your own recovery. And for me, I think that was pivotal. The fact that I took responsibility for my own recovery. Yeah, so I guess to answer your question, I didn't. I do the usual treatment. I went to the oncologist. I heard what he had to say. He let me know that I could buy some time, really look into it, look at all my alternatives. And I decided after looking into chronic lymphocytic leukemia that so much of it had to do with lifestyle. So immediately I started forcing myself to sleep 8 hours or 9 hours a night, which was, it seemed like all I was doing was sleeping. I quit all but one job, which seemed very strange for me because I was home a lot. I did get very sick for about 8 months. The leukemia advanced and it wasn't going well for some time. My immune system was really poor. I changed my diet so that I eliminated almost all sugars, all starchy carbohydrates, all highly processed foods and fried foods, anything with tons of sugar in it or caffeine. And that was a big change for me too. I became very, very careful in what I ate and what I drank. And then one of the biggest things that I did, I'm also a clinical hypnotherapist and know a lot about the power of the mind and how to get into a meditative state. By this time, I'd been meditating every day for about an hour or two for 7 years. And so I did a lot of
Wow.
meditation and I started visualizing the outcome. Joe Dispenza calls it remembering the future. I would start seeing myself very healthy, very well, really muscular and fit again, and full of life and energy. The other thing I did is called a mind-body conversation. There were a group of doctors here at University of Washington that found with brain tumored patients, if before they knew the exact diagnosis, if they asked them, they said, just get in a calm state and then ask your body, uh, do you have a brain tumor? How big is it? If there's a yes, how big is it? Where in your head is it? Is it up or down, front or back, side or side, left side or right side? And they'd have them answer these questions. Then they'd put it in a sealed envelope, and then they'd do a CAT scan and have the technician write it down, put it in a sealed envelope. 8 out of 10 times they were right. And so they
Wow.
developed this idea that we have an innate wisdom, or what they called a body knowledge. And so they started asking these patients to ask themselves, what do I need to do to let this go? Or
Mm.
why is it here? And so it took me about 2 or 3 weeks before I settled down out of my terrified state enough to remember, oh, I could have a mind body conversation. And so I got
Mm.
into a time of meditation and started asking the leukemia, why are you here? And I felt my body tell me, you nurse your anger and hold on to your fear. And I was kind of shocked because I'm not a terribly angry guy and I wasn't connected to being fearful at all. But once I started noticing my thought patterns during the day, I had really kept them below the surface. And so one of the things that I
Right.
started doing then, but now I do it, even though I'm extremely healthy and very well now, I do it as a matter of just self-care. I call it zeroing out. About an hour before I go to bed, I turn off all screens. I go upstairs. Many times I take a nice hot bath. And then I call it my VHS meditation. I imagine I'm putting in one of those old VHS tapes. You're probably too young to even remember them. And I push play and I start watching my day and I watch my body at the same time. And anytime I feel my body clench up, I hit pause. I ask my body, what's the emotion it's feeling? And then I give my body permission to let it go. And I'm not letting go of what I would have done or should have done or could have done or will do. I'm just letting it go for that night. I'll deal with it in the morning if I have to, but I let it release from my body. And the body will release just about anything if you give it permission. And so I go all the way through my day until I've released everything. And then I play back through it again just to make sure. And I can't tell you how much that's helped. I realized that I, like most adults in America, and I don't know, perhaps everywhere in the world, we carry years, decades of junk, old emotions into every day, and then wonder why we're not feeling happy, alive, present, playful. Well, we're carrying too much weight. And very
True.
quickly, especially this second time, I started really being very careful and very methodical with it when I was dying in 2013 to do this. Within about a month or two, I started noticing I'm the only adult in a grocery store that's actually awake. All the others are just standing there someplace else in the past or the future or on their phones. And
Mm.
it was sad, but it was also pretty thrilling at the same time to know I'm dying, I've got cancer, and I'm having a better time than most of the people I see, which is kind of sad. Yeah.
True, that's a wonderful share, and I mean, it just shows us how completely intuitive and patient you were throughout this time because it can get quite tough for people who, are diagnosed with such an illness or a chronic illness of any sort, or even something as little as diabetes, right? Like they take it up, and the easiest thing to do at that moment is for someone to tell you what to do, and that's the way we usually go, right? Like we completely give our control to our doctors and probably even don't do the things we can easily change in our lifestyle and just completely rely on that pill and that medication. And I want to know that how were you able to have such unshakable faith at the beginning in itself, right? Like, and also when you were still falling sick for 8 months and you were at a very weak phase in your life, but how are you still having so much faith in what you were doing? And like, how did you not doubt yourself at any point that, is it the right direction for me or should I, consult my doctor again? Should I do for any other treatment? How was that? Because I think it can be quite tough for a lot of people, no matter how much support they might have. And especially if people who have not been very proactive about their health, right? Like, I mean, you have had a childhood growing up, being so active and actually having a real good love for this, right? Like this kind of a lifestyle and movement and exposure to nature, all of these things. But not everybody has this, and not everybody has been very proactive. And then when this news is broken to them, the whole world is shook, right? And then that's the easiest thing to do is to rely on somebody else to tell you what to do. So, how was that for you? And what would you say to people today who might be facing something like this to have that kind of faith in what your body tells you and to even be patient enough to listen to what your body is telling
Yeah, that's a great question. I wouldn't have called my faith unshakable. I think I was still scared. I think I was very sick, but I think I'd participated in so many endurance events in my life. I climbed the tallest mountain in Oregon. It's Mount Hood. It's 11,000 feet tall. And when I was 9 years old, my dad would take me up these mountains and he'd say, "Are you tired?" Like, I'm a little kid. I'm 8, 9 years old. Yeah, Dad, I'm tired. Good. Helps you know you're alive. Keep going. Okay, Dad. And I learned from him at an early age to put uh, pain and tiredness and exhaustion kind of somewhere back in my mind and just take the next step. And if you keep going, you'll be rewarded. As I've looked back, I think that early mountain climbing experience and then learning and reinforcing that through triathlons and other ultra endurance events helped me to learn how to become a good cancer patient because it is a marathon event. You've got to take
you.
it one step at a time. You've got to keep going even though you're tired. You've got to keep going even though you're scared it's not going to end well. I mean, there were several mountains we got snowed out or things happened and we couldn't finish. And that's just the way it is. There were a couple triathlons I didn't finish because of heat exhaustion, that sort of thing. So I'd had times where it didn't end well, and I knew what that was like, but I thought the worst it could be is I die. And that wouldn't be so bad for me, but it would be bad for my daughter, I felt. And so I was really
Right.
not just, I think part of what made it more unshakable is I was wanting to do this not for my own sake, but for my daughter's sake. I wanted her to have a dad. Yeah. And so I think that was important too. And so those two things I think really helped guide me. Plus, I'd seen so many people have cancer and do exactly what the doctors said, and it turned out really
Mhm.
poorly. Their quality of life was much lower. Plus, I'm a
Right.
therapist, and I'd had many doctors in therapy working on their marriages or their own lives, and I'd hear how they think, and it really took them off a pedestal for me. many of them, I'm like, they're not as smart as I am, and they're sure not making good decisions in their lives. And so it took them out of that godlike status where just because they're wearing a white coat and have a degree, I think they're smarter than me and going to care about me and make good decisions. I got to the point where I heard so many of them make really poor decisions in their personal lives. I didn't trust their decision making. And so I went in a bit skeptical as it was. Yeah.
Wow, that's really interesting. And you also talk about how your dad also fought cancer, right? Like, was this before you or after
It
you were
was.
diagnosed?
He
And
had
did it
prostate
have
cancer.
any?
It did. It made an impact, and I was going to mention that as well. He had prostate cancer first, and then he had chronic lymphocytic leukemia, just like I did. Even though according to Western medicine, there's no genetic link whatsoever. But I saw a few characteristics. I am my father's son. He was much more angry than I'll ever be, I think. He was old school male tough guy. I never was. But he held on to that anger a lot and was pretty gruff in many ways, even though he was a wonderful dad and husband and still is. But I saw him go the traditional route and do everything. To this day, he's now 88. He's still doing everything the doctors say, and they've had him on a chemo pill for the last 5 years that he
Mhm.
takes every day. It's a long story, but I've seen it just create so many lifestyle and health problems for him that, but I saw him also not die. And so I thought, okay, with chronic lymphocytic leukemia, my chances of death are low at first. I wonder if I could do it in a way that's a little more thoughtful than what I saw my dad do. So that was helpful as well.
That's great. And was there something that you and your dad were doing together? Like, does companionship play any role in, in the journey of fighting cancer or becoming better? Like, was there something you both were proactively doing together, and what kind of a support system that created for you?
Well, we've always been very close, and we didn't do much together from the time I was 18 to the time I was 50 because I went to play soccer for a college in Kansas, of all places, which is 2,000 miles away from here, not knowing I'd fall in love with a cute little Kansas farm girl and put myself in exile for love. And so I did that because my biggest goal in life was to recreate the type of marriage and family I'd seen my parents create. And so I fell madly in love with this cute little Kansas farm girl. And she said, "Hey, I'm not going back to Oregon just because I love you. My family's here. You came out here. I didn't go out there. Take some time to think about it." And I did and decided I loved her enough to make the commitment to live in this tiny little Kansas town. Of course, I was young and didn't really know what I was committing to, but that put me 2,000 miles away from everything I loved, including my family, for 30 years. And that was all fine and good. But then in 2010, very quickly, she was diagnosed with a brain tumor. By the time they found it, it was the largest one our neurosurgeon had ever seen. And 52 days later, she was dead. And that's when my dad really partnered with me. I was devastated. I just nearly went out of my mind because I had given up my whole life for 30 years to live here with her, and now she was gone. And so I felt terribly cheated. And he was really there for me. And so that made us extremely close again. I very quickly, within a year and a half or so, because of the grief, was diagnosed with not only leukemia, but lymphoma as well. And I decided to sell my private practice out there, which by then was thriving. But I just didn't want to live in Kansas anymore, especially since my daughter was now in college and she decided to come to college out in Oregon. So I thought if my daughter is back here in the place I love, I'm going to move back home, be close to my family. And I thought that was a good idea until I got out here. And I saw my family quite a bit, but mostly I was just renting for the first time in 30 years. And without all of my adult friends, they were back in Kansas and living in a little duplex all by myself and really depressed and just alone too much of the time. And so my cancer got terribly worse over the next couple years, and by 2013, I was down to 152 pounds. Right now, I'm 6'1" and a half, and I weigh about 210, 215. And so I was about half of what I am now. And the biggest thing on me were my lymph nodes under my jawline, and I was dying. And my dad was there for me to talk me through it. He was pushing me really hard, like the oncologist, to do chemo and radiation. And I just still thought if there's any way I can do something else, I will. But nothing was working. And then I got this crazy idea. I'd seen many of my clients come back using Viktor Frankl's work, Man's Search for Meaning. He found that if you're passionate about a purpose, you have the best chance to survive. And so for weeks, I prayed for a purpose to come to mind, but nothing made sense. I mean, I'd written a book, it had done well. I had developed a practice. I really didn't have the strength to do that. I'd had a speaking career. I knew that if I got up in front of a crowd, I might cry because I was still so sad. And I couldn't even say my wife's name without crying. And so I was in no state to get up in front of a crowd and speak. Plus, I was too sick and I looked horrible. I felt like I was disfigured. And then I thought, well, while I'm waiting for the universe to answer me, maybe I should unpack because I'd lived in this little duplex for 6 months and I hadn't unpacked anything. So I started unpacking and I found a box my mother had put together of my childhood things. And there was a journal and that I'd been forced to keep when I was 11 years old for a school project. And I opened it up and it said, when I get old, I gotta climb Mount Everest, swim the English Channel. And something inside of me just lit up. I thought, yeah, I'd forgotten that, Dean. He didn't want to work two jobs. All he wanted to do was be a world-class adventurer. And so I thought, okay, I can't climb Mount Everest because my immune system's so bad it wouldn't handle elevation, maybe wouldn't even handle the food in Kathmandu. I don't know. But I can swim the English Channel. I don't know why I thought I could. And so immediately, without telling anyone, I started planning to do that. And it brought hope and excitement back into my life. And that was the real turning point.
Wow. And what did your doctors have to say about this, like you taking this step while you were still fighting cancer?
You are out of your mind. They said, Dean, not only no, but my oncologist said, hell no. he said, he said, what are you thinking? He said, your immune system is so bad, you get in a public pool, it could kill you. And I said, I'm dying anyway, doc. I said, what do you want me to do? Die watching TV? Some game show? I'm not going to go out that way. If I'm going to go out, I'm going to go out trying my best. And he said, well, okay, but be warned. And so he gave me specific things to do, even a certain type of soap to wash my body with and things to rinse
Okay.
out my eyes and my ears and my mouth and after every swim. But that first swim was almost 10 years ago today. It was August 13th, 2013. And for 3 years, I just suffered and felt lost. But when I pushed off the wall and started swimming, it felt like me. It was the first time I felt like myself again. And so I did a flip turn. I'm coming back. And then I didn't feel like myself because I was out of gas even before I got one lap because I was still so sick. And so I barely made it back. And I promised myself to do 10 laps because the English Channel is 20 miles long, for give or take. It depends on how you hit the currents. And I wanted to do one length of the pool for each mile of the channel just to start. And then every day I was going to add a lap. And so I did my 10 laps. Usually 10 laps takes me about 8 minutes, maybe nine. I mean, it's
Mhm.
super easy. It took me an hour. So uh, I would do one length and then just breathe heavily on the side of the pool and then do another length and breathe for a while. And then when I got to 10, I heard my dad's voice. And when I was a little kid, he would always make me climb. And he'd say, "Are you tired?" And I said, "Yeah." And he says, "Are you done?" And I said, "Yeah, I think so." He said, "Okay, do it again." And he'd make me learn how to go the extra mile, so to speak. And so I heard his voice and
Mhm.
he's like, "You done?" I'm like, "Yeah." It took me an hour. And do it again, do at least one more. So I did one more. So I did 11 that first day. And then every day I added one more lap. And by
Right.
November, all of my numbers were going in the right direction in my blood tests. I was starting to add weight again and some muscle. My lymph nodes were starting to go down. And by Christmas time, my head was clearing. And I remember getting out of the pool in late December, and the thought occurred to me, who cares if another middle-aged man puts on a Speedo and swims to France? It does the world no good, and in your case, it won't be a pretty picture. And so I thought, well, that's true. What could I do? How could I do this so that it would do the world some good? Because as a teacher and as a therapist, that's always been my mission. And not too long after that, I remembered 30 years earlier, I had been standing by the Willamette for a family picnic, and we were looking down at it, and we really put in a lot of environmental protection laws for the last 10 years. Before that, it was 1984. And from the 70s into the 80s, we put a lot of controls on the river. And it finally, all during my childhood in the 60s and 70s, it was so polluted. It was just one big oil slick. But I remember standing above it and it was blue and beautiful. And you could see the banks and you could see the rocks in the
Mhm.
water. The water was so clear and you could see fish. And I said to my dad, "Has anybody ever swam this whole thing?" He said, "What?" And I said, "Has anybody swam the whole Willamette?" He's like, "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Why do you come up with stuff like this?" And because he said that, it kind of put the hook in, and I that's when I decided someday I would like to swim the Willamette. Well, that came back to mind, and I thought, oh, that's so much better because it's here. I wouldn't have to travel to England. I could do it right here. I could involve my family and friends. I could contact the local leukemia society, see if they want to partner with me. And so that's when it all really started. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing to find purpose when you are amidst this weakness and this situation. It's something very rare that we, get to witness and get to see. And coming to the most important question today is what is the wild cure? What is it all about? How did you discover this? And what do you want people to know about the wild cure today?
Yeah. When I swam the Willamette, I loved nature, But like my parents, I saw it like God's amusement park. I didn't see nature as living beings, or there wasn't the science to know about the vibrational frequencies or any of that. I swam it in June of 2014. And by then, I've been taking daily ice baths for almost a year. I started that almost immediately because I knew if my body was going to handle the temperature, because, well, the Willamette is basically a snowmelt river. And so when I swam it, it was 40 to 42 degrees Fahrenheit. That doesn't sound very cold until you realize it's only 10 degrees above freezing. And I was in it for 8, 9, 10 hours a day swimming. It was the biggest challenge because even with the 3 mil wetsuit, I'd start going into deep hypothermia about after 45 minutes. And I'd have to get out and do jumping jacks and run in place to warm my body back up because I could feel my internal organs start to bang against my rib cage, which showed me that I was going into what's called thrombosis, which is not a good sign. Um, but in 2014, I'd never heard of Wim Hof and cold water plunging or cold water immersion. I'd never heard of Wallace J. Nichols and the theory of the blue mind, that when you're
Right.
in, on, around, or by water, it puts the brain in a meditative state. And they're now using that for many trauma victims. I didn't know anything about Clinton Ober and earthing, this idea that the earth has vibrational frequencies, that if we take off our shoes or get in water, we naturally get those going through our body. I didn't know any of that. I was just trying to accomplish a dream, but thankfully and fortunately for me, that dream included all of those. And so every day
Right.
I was swimming 10 to 12 miles a day, which is about 3 to 5 marathons in swimming. So a long ways, and very, very cold, which was boosting my immune system. I was moving with the flow of the river, which was easing my mind. I was moving my lymphatic system, which was extremely good for my lymphoma. And I
Right.
was absorbing that earthing, that vibrational frequency from the Earth's core. And so all of this was happening. And the first blood test I took after I was done with the swim, the leukemia was gone. I was in what's called radical remission. Well, that really,
Wow.
I knew that couldn't have happened by accident. And so I really started looking into scientific reasons this could have happened. I thought it was a miracle, but many times miracles have scientific explanations. And so I
True.
started looking, and that's when I found Wim Hof and Wallace J. Nichols and Clinton Ober and all of these researched ideas as to what had happened. And it also, being in the river, that connected to water, feeling the flow of it, feeling like I was actually partnering. I started after about the 6th day calling it Mama River, because she just felt like this big, beautiful mother with her arms around me, just gently guiding me. And I became so connected to nature during that time that I thought, you know, there's got to be, and then because it had cured me, I thought, we are looking at this all wrong. And there's this field called eco psychology. It's the study of the therapeutic use of nature. And the basic
Hmm.
tenet of that is that we're out of our natural environment. And that's why we're all so addicted, depressed, anxious, and sick, is we're wild animals that have been too overly domesticated. And so I believe the
Right.
more we can get out in the wilderness, the more we can nurture that wild part of ourselves, the more we see and interact with the four elements: earth, which is a wonderful grounding technique; water, which helps your emotions and flow; air, which helps, I mean, that's the breath. It helps mindfulness, present moment, inspiration. And then fire, watching the fire puts you in a hypnotic state. I found all I have to do with a group is get them around a fire and they'll start telling their stories and interacting. I don't have to encourage them to do it. It's because we've been doing it for eons as as humans. And so the wild cure is learning how to connect with these four elements on a very routine basis to let them recalibrate and help us recover from this overly digitized lifestyle we live.
Right. That's really amazing to know, and I can't wait to read the book for myself. And I hope that our listeners also get right on it. The links would be in the description below, so definitely go check it out. And just to put it more into perspective, what would you say are some things that, two things over here? So, a set of people who are probably seemingly healthy right now and they are young and but they lead very busy lifestyles like you did at one point, and they're juggling jobs or they're staying up late at night and probably under a lot of stress. And the other set of people is someone who's just been diagnosed with some sort of an illness and they're really struggling to find that faith and to even, they're probably not even thinking about these alternative approaches, right? How should these two set of people approach the wild cure, and what would you want them to start with right away?
Yeah. The young folks, or any, it doesn't really matter if they're young or old, get up, get moving, get outside, find your way of connecting with nature. I swim in rivers every day. Maybe you don't want to do that. Maybe you want to just go sit by a river and have a nice picnic. I go out and I spend one full day deep in the forest, all by myself, way off of the path. And I spend the whole day praying and meditating and feeling the energy of the trees. Maybe you don't want to do that. Maybe you just want to take your dog and walk through a nice park. Find your way of connecting with nature, and then also taking some time to just breathe in the beauty of it and feel it. And it doesn't matter where you live. There are beautiful areas no matter where you live. You can find beauty anywhere, I believe. And so for especially those young folks like you were talking about, put down the video games at least for an hour, get outside, do something fun that you enjoy, but is very natural and nature based. I would also encourage the young folks to start getting in ice baths. That's one of the quickest ways to kind of recalibrate mind and body. And then for someone that has just been diagnosed and wants to look into alternative cures, there's one of the first things I'd encourage that they do is read Kelly A. Turner's Radical Remission. It's a wonderful book. I think it was around before I swam the Willamette. I think she wrote it in 2012. It was a New York Times bestseller. I'd never heard of it. I didn't run into it till 2018, and I was watching a documentary called Heal on Netflix. And when she talked about the 9 things that radical remission folks do, it brought tears to my eyes because intuitively I had done all 9. And
Right.
it's a real great map or outline for anyone who's been diagnosed. The other thing I'd suggest is there are a lot of good health coaches out now, even through Radical Remission, the Radical Remission group, Kelly Turner's group. I'm one of her health coaches. And there are those of us who've been through the cancer journey, rather than try to recreate the wheel and learn all these hard lessons on your own, kind of like I did. uh, I would encourage people to just take some time, come to a person like me or me, and learn from our experience so that you can make the best decision for yourself. It's, if your life depends on it, it's time to hire somebody as another consultant. And I think
True.
I've got a very unique perspective because, unlike most health coaches, number one, I've got 33 years of experience. Most health coaches don't have that, and a clinical degree as a therapist. I've also had both sides of cancer. I've lost my wife to cancer, but then I also struggled with it. And I'm one of the only cancer health coaches I know that never had chemo or radiation and had a radical remission. So I think I've got a pretty unique set of skills to help others going through that. If they'd like to contact me, all they have to do is go on my website, thewildcureway.com, and schedule a clarity call.
Absolutely, and that's really good to know. I mean, I also have personally know a family and friends who are battling this, and there is no way that they are connected to a whole new world like you just, introduced us to right now, and you've been introducing us to like through your Instagram and through your socials, the way that you're sharing your story through your book, right? I mean, they just don't even know that that sort of a thing even exists, and I can't wait just right
Right.
after this recording to even talk to them and for them to discover this for themselves. So it's really amazing for you to share that. And just the last thing to conclude is, what would a typical week for you look like with all of these approaches? Like, what exactly did you include, and what would a week in your life look like when you were proactively uh using the wild cure?
Yeah. Well, for me, I can only tell you what my week looks like, and then several others. But I start every day with an ice bath. I've got an ice bath out in my garage. I keep it 36 to 38 degrees Fahrenheit. For years, I kept it at 42. Now it's even lower. And it's pretty cold. I only stay in it for about 3 to 5 minutes, enough to get that real blast and that shock that goes through my body gives me a wonderful cocktail of serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin, all the feel good chemicals and hormones. So I start my day very happily. And then I go ahead and go about my day. There's several other things I do. I watch my diet still very closely, but I will do something. I'll break it twice a week just to make it sustainable. I don't think anyone should try to ever be perfect. I think they should have fun a couple times a week. If you're doing things fairly routinely, your body's not even going to notice once or twice. And so that's something that I do. I start every day with a morning routine, end every day with an evening routine, like we discussed. And then almost every day at about 6 a.m., I will go to a local river that's just absolutely gorgeous and swim a mile or so, sometimes more, sometimes less. But I feel the river, and I'll swim downstream, and I call it the training of truth. I started this 3 years ago. And then I'll flip around and swim upstream. And that really trains my brain, because even though it even happened today, because the water's so clear, I can see every pebble on the bottom, and I'll get about 10 yards going with the current, but when I turn around, I'll only get about 2 inches with each stroke. And my if I'm a half a
Right.
mile or a mile away and I'm only making an inch at a time, my brain starts screaming, "Don't! You're never gonna make it. Get out!" And you just learn to turn that volume down. And I think especially for a cancer patient, that's really important. As a matter of fact, when I started taking the ice baths, uh, that's when I really started gaining a lot more control and a lot more clarity mentally. Because even though I've been doing ice baths for 10 years, right before you get in, part of your brain starts screaming, "Don't, don't get in, it's too cold. And if you just learn how to turn that voice down, but get in anyway, after a while, it gets easier. You become more resilient. It gets easier not to listen to those screaming, fearful voices. So I try to connect with nature at least 6 days a week. And then one day a week, every Friday, I get out deep in the wilderness by 7 or 8 a.m. and stay till about 7 or 8 p.m. And I just take my backpacking hammock, maybe a snack, maybe a book, usually some water, and I'll just get in my backpacking hammock and just pray and meditate and sleep and watch the trees all day long. Yeah. And really that's
That's
where
amazing.
my that's where my stress gets released and I get recharged. Yeah.
Right, and I'm sure that spending a whole day in the forest by yourself and just being there can also help us align our body clocks with that of the nature, right? Like, because right now we are so used to completely functioning on a clock outside our body, like wake up at this time, eat at this time, even if you're not hungry. And so many of these things, it's just conditioned, and we're not even connected with our own body and its own timing. So I'm sure that would also help us a big way. And one more highlight that I understood from your story is it's really amazing how you share what your endurance training and your resilience training as a younger person helped you through your journey, right? Like, because today also people might be training for triathlons or any other endurance sport, or even just taking ice baths to be more resilient and or meditate, and they don't even know what it might help them in their life later on. I mean, probably it's not
Right.
cancer, it's just a difficult situation in your life. It can be anything, but they just don't know the importance it would have, and the impact it would have on their life later on, right? Like, I mean, most of the people do it just to lose weight or just to look a certain way, or probably just feel good on that particular day, right? Like, but we just don't know what a greater impact that endurance, that resilience would have in our life and play a role in our life later on. And like, you're a great example showing this to us and teaching us these ways. So thank you so much for that.
Oh, well, thank you. That's very kind. Yes. And part of what I call healthy endurance is gratitude. A lot of times, one of the most frequent questions I get is when I swim these long rivers for hours and hours and hours at a time. It's hard. It's not easy. And nobody's watching, and it's cold, and you're tired, and you begin to wonder why you're doing this. And a lot of marathon swimmers tell me that they sing songs over and over, and or one guy I was talking to, he says he'll watch his favorite movie, and to me, that's kind of tragic because you're in this living, moving being and you're doing this thing. Why not be in your body while you're doing it? And people said, well, how could you have done it when you were so sick and had no money and all this other kind of stuff? And I said, I'd spent a lot of time in hospitals, and here I was back in Oregon in this beautiful river. I was just so grateful to be able to be strong enough to be in this beautiful place instead of a hospital bed. It never occurred to me to feel sorry for myself. And so I think gratitude, practicing that daily is really important as well as part of kind of an endurance or health regimen. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, we very often notice how the big things might help us in our journey in becoming healthy, or like, like big medicines or the big treatments, or going all our way out. And I mean, for someone like me, just looking at you and going for swimming in that kind of condition is a big thing for me, right? Like, but even to think about gratitude or simple meditations that you practiced, it's not always just the bigger challenges that we need to take up, but also these smaller things might help us a long way to go. So that's really a good takeaway from your share and from your story. And as we
Oh,
conclude
good.
today's episode, is there any last message that you'd like to leave us with?
Just don't believe in limits. I believe we can all do way more than we would have ever guessed that we can. I mean, when I swam the Willamette, I was an active cancer patient. I was 54 years old. I I'd never been on a swim team. I'd never won a swim race. I'd never swam in a river. I mean, I played around, but never a long stretch of rivers. And yet I believed I could do it if I just refused to quit. And that's most of it. If our limit is only when we quit or quit believing in ourselves, you can do the human mind and body is almost infinitely powerful and can do way more than we know right now and give it credit for. And today we are all so comfortable and sedentary, we don't challenge ourselves much intellectually, emotionally, physically, spiritually. I would really encourage everyone to get out in nature, challenge themselves to do the hard thing, and keep doing it. I tell everyone the sweet spot, you've picked the right dream, the right goal when you're right halfway in between, really excited and totally terrified. If you're not a little terrified, the goal isn't big enough. And quite honestly, almost every day getting in the Willamette, I was scared. I mean, you can drown.
Right.
It wasn't an easy thing, but it was exciting. And I hadn't had much excitement in my life for a long time. And so I would really encourage people to become active, have a dream, and don't put limits on that.
Amazing. Thank you so much. That's a really powerful message. And I hope that our audience are encouraged today just to learn more about you, more about your book, more about everything you're talking. And also, you gave us some great references for our audience to go and check it out for themselves, do their own research, and start including these practices in their life. Thank you so much once again, Mr. Dean, for being here today. We're really grateful to have you.
Well, thank you so much, Sakshi, for having me here and giving me the chance to share. And thank you for all that you're doing for the world to get this message and other messages out.
Thank you so much. That's it for today's episode. I am Sakshi Pawar and I'll be your host for the Settle or Be Better podcast. So stay tuned while we bring more inspiring stories. You know the drill. Subscribe to the Settle or Be Better podcast, like, share, and comment on our videos. And oh, hit the bell icon because you don't want to miss the mind boggling health discussions we're about to bring for you. Why settle when you can be better?